would like to thank NSF and Institute of Medicine for the opportunity to come to this meeting. And I'd like to thank David Hawkins for piquing my interest in this. I've been an advocate for some years of developing principles and standards for benefit cost analysis, and I'd like to think that the principles and standards work that we did for the MacArthur Foundation at the Benefit Cost Center has at least played a role in increasing interest in this subject. And I do believe that any reasonable set of standards would really be a major contribution and would be certainly better than having no standards at all. In this case, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I mean, you're never going to have perfect standards. They'll always be evolving. I wanted to, been asked to talk really about a couple of areas in the area of benefit costs that might be contentious. And so I wanted to talk about two. And one is the issue of the potential compensation test. And the economists really got into benefit cost work in the late 1930s. And it evolved, the idea evolved out of the British economists, Caldor, Hicks, Lionel Robinson, and a few others. And the idea then that was created was the idea that if hypothetically the winners from a project could compensate the losers, then the project was a good project. And combined with that idea was the idea that you needed to avoid interpersonal comparisons of utility so that moral sentiments were not to be included, considerations about income distribution were not to be included in analysis of benefit cost. And that has remained more or less, and with time it's less the standard of the day. Now, I don't think that this criteria is satisfactory, and I would suggest that it's something that might be noted in any set of principles and standards. First, the moral justification, which is the idea you could have potential compensation, is really a figment. You can't have actual compensation. And so that the reliance on the potential Pareto really falls short. In fact, some work I did suggests that the costs of actually compensating losers in a particular project would in many, if not most cases, be greater than any net value of the project itself. So that the hypothetical compensation, which is regarded as costless compensation, it costs you nothing to compensate, or in fact it costs you quite a lot to compensate. The administrative costs are extremely high. Second criticism of the potential compensation test is that it does not always work in the realm of law. Where you have disputes, the sum of the expectations of the parties will exceed the total value to be had. And so you can never pass a compensation test, a potential compensation test. Nevertheless, benefit cost principles can be used to make legal decisions in that case and should not be hung upon the potential compensation test. Thirdly, the potential compensation test leads to Skatowski reversals. Now, none of you who are not approaching my age will probably know anything about Skatowski reversals. Tibor Skatowski in 1941, when I was still alive, showed that using the Caldor-Hicks test, it's possible to move from a position A, a state of the world A, to state of the world B. And then using the same Caldor-Hicks test, it was then possible to move back from state of the world B to state of the world A. So it would recycle. Nevertheless, this was, of course, very upsetting in some sense to people. Yeah. But it's purely a creation of the potential compensation test. You drop the potential compensation test, you drop the whole issue of Skotowski reversals. Now, I don't want to, this is obviously not the place to talk at length about Skotowski reversals, and I don't propose to. There's a final, there are two more, I think, suggestions that rely on this. One is that the counter-Hicks test itself, which is using compensating variations to measure benefits and costs, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to pass the compensation test itself. And finally, a better alternative is available. And so let me mention just a few words about the alternative. Sorry, I forgot to do my slide. There it is, and I've left out the necessary but not sufficient condition. One of my graduate students, Tyler Scott, and I done a simulation of what happens when you consider a portfolio of benefit cost projects. What happens to the number of losers at the end of the day when you're done with the portfolio? And so we've done this and made a variety of different assumptions, just a few of which have shown up here. It turns out that while one person will lose from a project because they pay taxes to support the project, and other people are winners from the project, that subsequently the person that lost on the first project will gain from another project, and someone else will lose. Well, since each project can be expected, at least with some probability greater than 50%, to have net gains, at the end of the day, virtually everyone wins. So it's a straightforward Pareto justification for the use of benefit cost analysis. Now, this turned out to be surprisingly robust to changes in assumptions. So that about 90% of the people at the end of the portfolio win. Those that lose tend to, in our analysis, tend to lose because of the structure of the tax system. So it's a public choice issue. And this is true even if you allow for the fact that some of the projects don't really pass the benefit cost test. You're mistakes. It's true if you allow some gaming of the system and so on. So it's fairly robust to that. And I'm not going into the paper. I'm just using this to explain why I prefer a direct Pareto justification for, and not the potential compensation test. Well, the second topic I want to talk about is scares me because it is so convoluted and controversial, and that's the issue of the discount rate. Okay. What discount rate would you like? Pick a number. You can pick virtually any number and find justification for it in the literature. A rate of 0? Fine. A number of philosophers, including Parfit, who's fairly well known and widely respected, suggest a 0 discount rate. 30%? No problem. Andreoni, in the recent articles in the American Economic Review, suggests that he finds convergence of time preference rates of around 30% for various groups. Okay, fine. There's a huge literature on this issue, and it is both confusing and disparate. The rates that have been suggested are the rate of return to private investment, which would be, or the marginal rate of transformation in economic terms, which would be by our calculations about 8.5% real. Time preference rates, which are all over the board, ranging sometimes up to 100%. When you look at people's actual choices, they're rates that are based on weighted average of the rate of return and time preference rates. And this, I think, is where you begin to gain some traction as to what the rate should be. I think that this approach, with the opportunity cost of capital approach, or the social rate of time preference approach, and it's called, is the sort of the basic foundation on which discount rate should be chosen. Mm-hmm. There's a great deal of interest now in the Ramsey rate, which is the Ramsey equation, which has to do, again, with time preferences. And there's a good deal of recent literature, Weitzman and so on, talking about you need to have time declining rates, so that for benefits that are, or costs that accrue far in the future, the discount rate should be lower and lower. Well, what can we make of this? I think that the only strategy that will get you anywhere toward some kind of rough consensus is to develop the fundamental principles that you're going to use to decide upon the rate. And I'm going to suggest two principles. One is that ethical considerations and other extraneous considerations be excluded from the discount rate. You can incorporate them directly in values. Caldor was certainly wrong when he wanted to drop moral sentiments, for example, from benefit cost analysis. Moral sentiments are like any other good. There's a willingness to pay for them. So the value of moral sentiments is to be measured by the willingness to pay to realize them. Thus, the value of moral sentiments in terms of a benefit cost analysis has to do with whether you can measure them or not, and what's the willingness to pay for them. And that's true of the discount rate as well. You can put it directly into the value of the good, moral sentiments being the good, and not included in the discount rates. Same thing is true of what are special goods, things like the value of life and so on. There's a great deal of arguments that environmental goods, value of life goods and so on have special characteristics so that you ought to discount them at a much lower rate. Those, if they have special characteristics, that should be included in the actual valuation of the good, not in the discount rate. So that's the first principle that I suggest. The second principle is that the rate that's used in general should be no less than can be obtained from an alternative project. It's a simple opportunity cost, straightforward economic rationale. Well, what is that rate? Well, as I indicated, the rate of return to private in our estimates, and these are fairly consistent with others, I think, is the rate of return to private capital in real terms is about 8.5%. So we ask ourselves, for typical projects, what's the opportunity cost of capital? Well, the investment in a public project will displace some private capital, the 8.5% return to private capital. On the other hand, some of the investment will come from a reduction in consumption. So when you know the proportions that come from private capital and you know the proportions that come from a reduction in consumption, you can then use that rate that'll represent the opportunity cost of capital. We calculate it to be about 7% real, varying between 6% and 8.5, well, 6% and 8% is the range that we would give it. Now, of course, if a project, oh, how much time? I'm done? Yeah. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. The cane has not come yet. Finish your sentence.
I'm done. That's okay.
All right, we'll catch that up. All right. Thank you, Dr. Zerbe. All righty, maybe we'll have some time at the end to be able to expand on that. All righty. Our next speaker is Dr. Audubon Basu. Dr. Basu is an associate professor in the Departments of Health Services, Pharmacy, and Economics, and the director of the program in Health Economics and Outcomes Methodology at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Dr. Basu's research focuses on the theoretical and empirical foundations in cost-effectiveness analysis and value of information analyses in health and medicine. Specifically, Dr. Basu has developed novel methods and applied them to a variety of healthcare settings to study observed and unobserved heterogeneity in clinical and economic outcomes in order to assess the value and need of individualized care. Dr. Basu currently serves on the IOM Planning Committee for a workshop on observational studies in a learning health system, as well as on this planning committee. And he received his MS in biostatistics from UNC Chapel Hill and his PhD in public policy and health economics from the University of Chicago. So we welcome Dr. Basu.